Hey, good morning, everybody. We're at 70B at the very bottom. We're discussing the details of when the Omer is harvested. I'm Rabbi Blazer, Rabbi Yoshua Dudari. Rabbi Blazer said to Rabbi Yoshia of his generation. There was another Rabbi Yoshia. I think it's rather obvious if he's speaking to him that it's the one of his generation. Um, but maybe there was an older one at the time. Anyway, lo tesev akarech adim mefarshis leila hamas nisin. Stand here, don't sit down until you explain this Mishnah. Minayin lomer shematir b'hashrasha. Um, the Mishnah had said that how do you know that it's the Karban HaOmer, the Omer sacrifice, which allows the eating of the new grain that has already taken root. Okay, I mean, Allah Gemara says, "What? Where do you get it from?" Dichsiv, Aviv. It's obvious. When the Torah says, "What is this sacrifice?" It's Aviv. It's still in the ear, right? It's still on the stalk. Lav called the lav aviv. So there must be like something that's not included, something that's not still in the ear. And what is it? Lav aviv. So the Gemara says no. Um, and what would that be? That would be it hasn't taken root. Yes, versus delava v'ivaliol da'ayel shlish. Now what you can get from that is that there is still grain that's not considered in the ear, but it's still beyond taking root. Okay, and what that is, it grew to a third of its full size. So if just taking root is not enough to be considered in the grain um, uh, that's permitted by the Omer. It has to be grow to a third. So we need another source. Like, was it still? We want to know what's the source of the Mishnah that taking root is what allows it to be part of the permitted class of grain once the Omer is brought. Elam Shmuel mehachel chermesh from the time of the sickle. Um, so in other words, when it's grown enough to be harvested by sickle. So doesn't that imply that there's something before that stage, right? It's still too young to be harvested by the sickle. So Gemara says no. The lav bar chemer shuli olam shachas. That doesn't necessarily mean taken root. It could mean that it can't be cut by a sickle, but it has actually become mature enough to be used for animal fodder. Okay. So still the question is where does the Mishnah get the idea that taking root is what is the criteria? Rabbi Yitzchak, comma. It has to be standing grain. Lav miklal to lav bar comma. Um, and if doesn't that mean that there's something before the stage of being standing? And wouldn't that be the taking root? The Gemara says again, no, the lav bar comma uliolam agam. There's a stage in between, right? It's already taken root. It can, but it still has to reach the stage of agam, of being like marshy. All right. Now, if you think about a marsh, the stalks are kind of soft, and they're bent over. They're not developed enough yet. So we're still looking for a source for that the criteria is the root. Elamarava asher tizra mishan zriya. Rava says, actually, you know what's included in things that are permitted by the Omer? Mishas Zriya, from the time that it is sowed, right? And he understands that as being, that's when it takes root. I want to proper Rava, wait a minute. At the time that you sow it, it hasn't yet taken root. So maybe you're saying from this source, you would say that anything that's been planted, that's been sown, that would be included. Amalei, so he said to him, Sudni, smart, you're wise. But Sodek Siv, it says in the field. So if it only said Asher Tizra, then maybe that would be including anything that has been sown. But since it says in the field, it's something that's considered part of the field. When is it considered part of the field? When it grows roots. Okay. Next Mishnah, Kosrim Beis Hashlachin Shabbat Makin Avolo Godshin. So even before the Omer is brought and permitting all the, the harvesting and using of the grain, you can still harvest in an irrigated field in the valleys of a logochin, but you can't pile up the what you've harvested. Anshi Yericho, Kotzrim B'Tzon Chachamim, V'Goshin Shelo B'Tzon Chachamim. The people of Yericho, they were their fields are in the valley and are irrigated fields. In other words, they don't get enough rain to grow; they have to irrigate them. So they harvested before the Omer, and that was okay with the rabbis. V'Goshin Shelo B'Tzon Chachamim, but they also continued to pile up the grain, and that was not acceptable to the rabbis. Lo michu b'yadam, but they still didn't protest. Um, Now, the Gemara will discuss. Kotzer l'shachas and machil l'behema. You can reap again before the Omer. You can reap for fodder and feed it to your animal. Omer Yehuda Amasai was maschil ad shelo hevi shlish. That's if you are starting to do the harvesting before the crop gets to be a third of its full size. Rabbi Shimon Omer. No, even if it's more fully grown than that, you can still harvest it for fodder. For kosher mipnei netios, and there's another situations in which you can harvest early, harvest before the carbon homer. Mipnei netios, if you're trying to protect little trees, the planted trees, so you want to clear the area around the tree for the health of the tree, or mipnei beis hayavel, or you need the space in the field to allow mourners to sit there and for nichum avelim, and maybe beis medrash. And if you need to make room to build a beis medrash, then that's a good reason to cut down the crop early. In other words, you need the space, the land. And if you do have to harvest for any of these reasons, you can't make them into sheaves, but leave them untied. Mitzvahs ha'omer lavo min hakama. And the omer itself, the sacrifice that was brought to the Beis Hamikdash, should come from standing grain, right? In other words, you have to harvest it fresh. If you couldn't find any, then you can bring from cut grain. It has to be fresh, like damp. If you couldn't find anything fresh, you can bring dried. It's the mitzvah is to harvest it at night, the night after the first day of Pesach. Um, but if you do end up harvesting in the daytime, kosher, it's still good. Padachas Shabbos, and the reaping of the harvesting of the grain, it can be done even on Shabbos. If the Pesach was on Friday and the day after the Machras Shabbos is Shabbos, then that's a lot. But yeah, the day after the Yom Tov is Shabbos, then you can still do the Omer on that day. Tanya, Rabbi Yomi one pasuk says you should harvest it and bring the omer. And then it says the first of your harvest you bring to the Kohen. Um, so the first clause seems to say like do the whole harvest and then bring the omer, and the second one seems to say first, cut enough for the kohen, cut enough for the carbon, and bring that, and then you can do your harvesting after. Okay, so how do you explain this? From the place that you're going to bring the omer sacrifice, then you can't harvest there. In other words, a so here it's referring to what the Mishnah talked about was like not Beis Hashlachin, a field that gets its water from rain. So from that kind of place, you can't harvest until after the Yomer. But if there's a place where you're allowed to do the harvest, for example, an irrigated field, you can do the harvesting there without regard to whether the Omer has been brought. Ema mimin shatamevi atakoser mimin she'yatamevi atakoser. Why are you saying that the Torah is only talking about the location, the type of field? Maybe it's the type of grain. Maybe you should say that you know what you can harvest anything else but barley. But barley you can't harvest. Why don't you say that? Ahula matzah summers, meet Rabbi Yochanan. No, we already saw yesterday. Rabbi Yochanan said that it only applies to grain um, it applies. Rabbi Yochanan said it's all types of grain that you can't harvest before the Omer. So the only other available interpretation of this pasuk is, well, there are certain places where you can harvest. That's what that clause is referring to. Oh, the Mishnah said, "Anshe Yericho kotzin b'rtzon chachamim, v'godshin shlo b'rtzon chachamim." The people of Yericho, they harvested, and the rabbis were okay with that because they had irrigated fields. V'godshin shlo b'rtzon chachamim, they piled it up, and that the rabbis weren't happy with. Man shamas le'diyam are michu v'lo michu. Then the Mishnah went on to say. um, that the rabbis didn't prevent them. So Rabbi Yehuda, it's Rabbi Yehuda who talks about um, um, this whether that the rabbis didn't prevent them or didn't scold them for what they were doing. V'sav Rabbi Yehuda Katsira the Anshe Richo B'Tzon Chachamim Havai. Wait, you want to say it's Rabbi Yehuda? It can't be Rabbi Yehuda because Rabbi Yehuda would say that the Katsira doesn't. He wouldn't even be happy with the harvesting. The Vahatanya. And here's a mission, a brisa that proves that. Shisha dvarim also Anshe Richo. Shloshal B'Tzon Chachamim, shloshal B'Tzon Chachamim. There were six practices of the people of Yericho. Three were sanctioned by the rabbis, and three were not approved of. These are the ones that the rabbis approved of. Markivin dekolim kolayom. You can graft palm trees the whole day of Erev Pesach, and the karchin es shema, and they would kind of bundle together their Shema. We'll see what that means. V'kosrin lifnei Omer, and they would harvest before the Omer. B'tzon chachamim. The rabbis approved of all these things. What did they not approve of? Godshin lifnei Omer, piling up the harvested grain before the Omer. Umatirin gamzios shel hakdesh shel charuv v'shel shikma. And they would allow the use of these two types of trees of that were hekdesh, and upartzin paratzos beganosein upardosein lahachil nasher laniyim b'shnei batzaros b'shabbosos u'yomim tovim. They would make gaps in the walls of their gardens and their orchards so they could feed the fruit during a drought year to the poor people, so that the poor people could they would take down the wall so that the people could take even on Shabbos and Yom Tov. That's what Reb Meir is. Divrei Reb Meir, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Imr Tzacham Osin, you call it a Osim Ken. So then that means everybody could do it. If it means that they did this with the approval of the rabbis. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, none of these things the rabbis agreed with. But the rabbis, protested about three and allowed them to proceed with the other three. And what did they not protest? Markivin to call him kalayam, the thing with the palm trees, karching as shema and bundling as shema together, v'kosrin v'goshin lifnei omer, and both harvesting and piling up before the Omer. This is what they protested. Matirin gamzil shel hekdesh shel charv shel shikma, using the hekdesh branches of these two types of trees, and parsin process beganosein pardosein kadei hachil nesher lanashim b'shnei batzaros b'shabbosos v'yom tovim, making holes in their walls so that people could get the fruit on Shabbos and Yom Tov in a drought year. V'nosim pe'el yarak u'michu b'yadam, and also. And the idea of peah, where you're supposed to leave a corner of your field, so it only applies um, to grain, but they would use vegetables. And the rabbis didn't like that. So anyway, when it comes to our case of the grain, Rabbi Yehuda says that both reaping and piling was done without the approval of the rabbis. So how come the Mishnah? So if you want to say the Mishnah is like Rabbi Yehuda, why does it say implies the opposite that they approved of this? Shisha Shiva Havu. So if that's right, it says the Gemara, wait, count up the when we add the paya thing, then that makes seven. And you said there were only six. So it must be, some bad version in here. Elasami mikan ksira. So the from Rabbi Yehuda's statement, it's not included in the six things that that they that they approved of. Okay, so in other words, we have a incorrect version of the brisa. So indeed, Rabbi Yehuda said there were things that there were things that done with the approval of the rabbis, but it doesn't include what we thought it included. It doesn't include our case of Omer. Okay. Kosher l'shachas u'machlo behema. The Mishnah said you can harvest for animal fodder. It's not hasam. We have a Mishnah. Elu mafsikin lapea. Um, these things kind of divide a field into multiple fields. In other words, you have to do paya on your field. It's the corner of one field. How do you define the one field? But if you have consecutive adjacent plots, how do you determine what's the a plot that requires where each one requires paya? So here are things that divide fields into two. Hanachal, a stream. V'hashlulis, a canal. V'derech hayachid, a path, a private road. V'derech harabim, a public road. V'shvil harabim, and a public highway. V'shvil hayachid hakavua b'mos hachama b'mos hagshamim, and a private trail that's used in the summer or the winter, like rainy season or dry season. So all these different kinds of roads are considered borders of a field. V'habor, and a bor. So the Safari translates this as an uncultivated field. Um, so if you have if your two plots of land that are planted are separated by an unplanted field, an uncultivated field, then they're considered two separate ones. V'hanir, and a plowed field. V'zera acher, or a field that's planted with a different type of grain. V'koser l'shachas mafsik. A field that is so we've said if you have two different types of grain adjacent to each other, those are two separate fields, right? And koser l'shachas mafsik, and that includes if it's all barley, but in one section you're harvesting for human consumption, another section you're harvesting for fodder, those are considered two different fields. According to Rabbi Meir, no, the only thing that divides a field is if you also plowed the area that you harvested. Then it's considered a different type of field and it's separate for payah. Amar Rabbi Rechana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Meir b'shitas Rabbi Shimon Amara. Rabbi Meir was working within the view of Rabbi Shimon. Diamar, Yiksar v'yachil af mishevi shlish. Rabbi Shimon said in the Mishnah that you can harvest and feed the crops to the animals even after they reached a third of their size, of their full size. So Alma, so we see kasavar kol shachas lav ktsirahi. So that implies that raising crops for animal fodder is not it's not considered like regular barley, and so therefore cutting it down is not considered. That's the reason that harvesting it is okay. It's like a different species almost. So when Reb Meir says that that the fields are separate, that is like consistent with Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Yosef Rabbi Hashmata. Rabbi was sitting and teaching this. Esve Rav Acha Bar Hula Rabba. Rav Acha asked him, Achala Chagav Karsamua Nemalim Shibarto Aruach. If these calamities occurred, that the crop was eaten by locusts, or by, was destroyed by ants, or a windstorm, right? Hakol modim charash mafsik. Then everybody agrees that if you then plowed that section, then it divides the two fields that are alongside it. But lo charash ain't mafsik. But if you didn't plow it, then it's still part of the same contiguous field. Hakol modim. So who's admitting? Everyone agrees, right? Everyone admits, concedes. Who is that? Rabbi Meir. It's Rabbi Meir. So Yamar Bishlam must nisim b'shloy v'shlish brisa decharash in lo charash lo b'shehe v'shlish. So if you want to say that um, that Rabbi Meir holds like Rabbi Shimon, um, so so you can understand Rabbi Meir if you say that the Mishnah, where Rabbi Meir says that the ksira for animal fodder is separate, is not considered harvesting. So that could be where the animal fodder, where the grain had not reached a third, and the brisa is that, yeah, it depends. If it was plowed, then it divides the field, and if it's not plowed, it doesn't divide the field. That would be where it reached a third, right? So, so the difference between the rulings of Rabbi Meir is okay because it depends. Like if it has grown a third, you have one rule, and if it hasn't, then you have another rule. But if you want to say the Mishnah is even talking about where it grew a third, hashta uma hasam diksira the hasam amar Rabbi Meir. So you should say in both cases that if if it was talking about Katsira, Reb Meir said it's not Katsira, and then here in the Brisa he says it is Katsira. So, but like you would think that it would be even more so that it's Katsira, um, but the Gemara says Hakol Modim. The Brisa says Hakol Modim. That everybody agrees that it is Katsira as long as it doesn't divide the field. It doesn't. We'd say it is Katsira because it doesn't divide the field. El Rabbi Meir, Beshitas Rabbi Yehuda Amara. Rabbi Meir must be talking about not Rabbi Shimon, but Rabbi Yehuda's view. Diamar Amasai, Rabbi Yehuda said Amasai Bizman Sheischel Ad Shlohi Vishlish. That's if you started harvesting before the crop got to a third. But if you started, but if you started after the crop grew more than a third, then it's saucer. Then you can't then you can't harvest it before the Omer. Um, and so then you can understand the difference. So Gemara says, wait a minute. Amar the Shabbos Leila Rabbi Yehuda lebehema lebehema. Rabbi Yehuda was talking about fodder, right? Feeding an animal, the Adam Mishamis, but he wasn't talking about harvesting for human consumption. Then there would be three separate opinions: Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Shimon. Um, Ella Kiyasa Rav Dimi Amar, so Rav Dimi explained, Rabbi Meir, Beshitas Rabbi Akiva, Rabbo Amar. Yeah, there is a third opinion, as Rabbi Akiva. And he said, Afli Adam Name Lo Havia Katsira. Even if you're harvesting for human consumption, it's not considered ksira as regards peah. Disnan, Hamanamer Sada Vashirbo Kolachim Lachim. If you are harvesting a field like in a spotty way. Menamer means it's like spotted or stripes, maybe. Like you're harvesting like alternate rows. You leave gaps. And v'shirbo kolachim lachim, and you leave, a fresh, like, wet or moist stalks that aren't fully grown yet. Rabbi Kiva Omer, Pe'el kol echad v'echad. Then each row is considered its own field. And each row needs peah. V'chachamim omrim And the rabbis say meyachad al kol. No, it's all considered one field. You only need to do one corner for the poor. Rabbi Akiva el b'menamer liklayos. When does Rabbi Akiva say that each one is separate? When you are um, when you're reaping to roast the grain. Um, so that would be, for one kind of use. But if you're doing it la'otzar to store the grain, in other words, like so roasting the grain is like not as I don't know, elevated or something, a use as like storing it and I guess taking it to the mill or whatever. Um, then you don't need then you don't then they're not considered separate fields. Um, so what we're saying is that yes, here's a third opinion that could accord with Rabbi Meir. And this is what you can say the differences between the Mishnah and the Brisa. The Mishnah is talking about grain that's not ripe, that hasn't grown a third yet, um, and the Brisa is talking about the fully grown ripe grains. Okay, well, that makes sense. But Gemara says, "Aini, is that right?" V'haki asur Ravin on Rabbi Yochanan. But when Ravin came, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, "M'chayv Rabbi Kiva." Number Lotzar. No, Ravin says that's not what Rabbi Akiva says. Rabbi Akiva says that even if you were harvesting these strips um, for storing the grain, the most mature, I guess, the most complete use of the grain. Um, then Rabbi Akiva would still say that you're chayav pay on each one. So there is not a third opinion. There is not a Rabbi Akiva opinion that's a third. So Gemara answers, Savar like Kavasi B'chada, Polig le B'chada. Um, so Rameir agrees with Rabbi Akiva on one thing, that if you're harvesting grain for fodder, then if it hasn't reached a third of its growth, it's not considered the start of the whole crop. But he disagrees with Rabbi Akiva that getting to a third is also not the start of the Ketzira, because Rameir says that this is the kind of Ketzira that when it's done for animals, and so therefore it doesn't divide the field regarding Peah. Um, so that's how we can. So even though with regards to the Menamer, the Menamer field, Rabbi Akiva maybe did not disagree with regarding to the um, um, one second, even though even though that Rabbi Meir could disagree with Rabbi Akiva about animal fodder and whether it's included in the Omer or not, and he could disagree. He could disagree with Rabbi Akiva there, but he could agree with Rabbi Akiva that that in terms of dividing the field for Peah, um, the this is the start of the harvesting, even when it's done for animals, and so it doesn't divide the field regarding Peah. Okay,
I'm
and we'll
getting a
pick it
little
up here
bit lost
tomorrow.
here. But are we talking about Peah or Omer? When he can bring the Omer? Are we talking about when he's Chayiv and Peah?
We're trying to we're talking about both at the same time, I guess. Like we're trying to parse out, you know, if you have this opinion in one area, do you have the same opinion in the other area? And now what we're saying is that no, you could hold, they could be separate criteria. You could just because you have one criteria that works for payout doesn't mean that's the same criteria that works for the Omer.
So what do we say? What are the
So that's how you can have three opinions
so what are
with
the opinions here again? Can we summarize this? It got a
okay,
little confusing.
all right. Let's see. Um, so regarding the Omer, um, Rabbi Akiva has a third opinion. Let's start with it. Let's go backwards. Rabbi Akiva would say that um, harvesting animal fodder, um, which has not yet reached a third of its growth, is not considered. That's not included in the prohibition. Like you could do that before the Omer. That's Rabbi Akiva. Um,
And what about Peah? What is it? Is it
uh,
Chayiv and Peah?
And Rabbi Meir says about Peah that, or sorry, Rabbi Akiva would say about paya that even that if it's animal fodder, it doesn't even if it's fully mature, if you're doing it for fodder, um, then it does separate the rows, right? Then each row that you do is considered a separate field and requires paya.
Even though it's for animals and not for people.
Yeah,
And even though it hasn't reached a third of its growth.
right. Or no, even if it's beyond a third of its growth.
Beyond, but we before, just a moment ago, you mentioned less than a third of its growth.
Right. In other words, a third is the cutoff, but according to Rabbi Akiva, when it comes to paya, you don't that doesn't even apply. If it's fodder, it's fodder. It doesn't matter third or not or less than a third. It's not. It doesn't divide it divides the field for paya.
It does not divide the field. The pay is required regardless how much grows. Is that what we're saying?
If you're doing it in strips, right, and it's for fodder, okay, then each one is considered a separate field. In other words, it's like a separate harvesting.
So pay is required regardless how much grows.
Yes, right. Regardless how mature it is. That's right. And then it's a separate field regarding paya, and you have to leave paya for each strip.
Okay, but regarding the Omer, if it's less than a third, he's not required to. He can
Yeah,
use it before the
exactly.
Omer.
Right.
That's Rabbi Akiva.
Yeah. Um, right. And then Rabbi Yehuda, um, okay, one second. Rabbi Yehuda um, uses a third as the criteria for both paya and omer. Right? If it's not mature enough yet, if it's less than the third, then it's okay. Like it's not considered a separate harvest and for paya, and it's not, and you're allowed to harvest it before the Omer. And the third one was that was Rabbi Huda, um, and Rabbi Shimon.
We have Rabbi Meir too, right?
No, well, we're trying to slot Rabbi Meir into which one of these? Does he
Oh,
hold like Rabbi Huda, Rabbi Shimon, or Rabbi Akiva? Okay, um, and we end up with Rabbi Akiva. Now that we've discovered that there is Rabbi Akiva, that's a third opinion. And Rabbi Shimon says, like even after they reach a third, you can still harvest for the before the Omer. And when it comes to Peah, it's also um, it is the field is all one field, even though you're harvesting some of it for your animal.
it's all one field. What is all one field?
The question about paya is if you're doing, you're doing the field in separate strips,
Yeah.
does that make each one a separate field that requires paya, or do you just need the corner of the whole field as paya? And so
But this
that,
has to be one field. If we learned earlier,
yeah,
what
you have
has
to
to
do
be
pay on every
divided.
field that you have. Now the question is, how do you decide what's one field, right?
Right.
And what, right? So what if you're harvesting in strips? Does that separate those? Are those strips each considered a separate field, and each one requires paya or not? So
But if
that's
you
where you
have a
get these.
separation, if there's a bore, if there's a rock, if there's a
Right.
stream,
And
is
then
that
this,
that's a separate field according to Rabbi Shimon or not? If it's
yeah,
one owner.
it seems like everybody agrees that that makes it a separate field. What we're discussing is what if you're harvesting it in strips? Does that make it a separate field? So then you've got this distinction between depends. If are you is it like the early crop? Are you doing it for fodder? Um, that depends on the circumstances if these strips make it considered a separate field or not.
Would that matter uh, on the time period? Say one harvested today and the next one is Thursday, or would it matter? Does that make a difference, or does it not
No,
make a
I think the
difference?
only time cutoff would be the Omer, right? Like it's all talking about anything you did before the Omer. Uh,
So if you harvest a field Monday and one Thursday, but if it, but
oh, are
so
you talking about the Peah case?
yeah, okay, the payer case. Right, the payer
Yeah.
case. Does that make a difference, or is it when we're separating it
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
rows?
Whenever you harvest the strip, you have to determine, well, did that make it considered a separate field or not? It doesn't matter what day it was. If I did that with one strip today and a different strip tomorrow, it's the same question on each strip.
So even if one harvested on different days, if one considered the entire field, it wouldn't matter. Or if one considered
Right.
separate strips, if you harvested them at 9 o'clock in the morning and then 11 o'clock and we took a break for lunch or breakfast. So if you considered them separate strips, then there would be pay on each one of them. If you harvest them by 2 hour difference.
Yeah, I don't see how the time really factors into it.
Well, in other scenarios, it could make a difference.
Yeah.
There are
Yeah,
plenty
I
of
guess.
scenarios where time does matter.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Okay, we'll pick it up here tomorrow. Thank you, everybody.